much of a problem transportation is in early America. The roads are terrible. They're all dirt outside cities. Cities maybe have cobblestone roads, but that's it. It's dirt. The further you get away from the ocean or from major rivers, the longer it's going to take you to get anywhere. And again, as I mentioned very briefly, we seem to, I'm included in this, we always forget that the majority of stuff is still shipped by water to this day. Again, if you've seen those pictures of those giant cargo containers that come into California, I mean, the amount of stuff you can fit on one of those, I mean, I can't even imagine how many, cargo aircraft you'd have to fly, like probably 100 or more just to get that much stuff, okay? The majority of stuff still moves that way. We just don't think of it in those terms because we're used to thinking of everything as flying. Railroads will be the things that start to change our perception of time. Railroads will come in starting really in the 1830s. This is 1860, right as the Civil War is about to begin. But you can see there's a pretty extensive rail network in the north, less so in the south. Now, does anybody know why? Why isn't there as extensive a railroad network in the south?
There isn't.
There isn't. Why isn't there? See, there's fewer rails in the south than there are in the north. Why?
More land to cover.
Okay, geographically it is bigger. That is true. But even if you were to do it per capita, it's still less. Sorry?
Agricultural lands.
It's agricultural, but what's key about the agriculture? What kind of agriculture is in the South prior to the Civil War?
Slaves.
Well, there's slavery involved, but it's cotton. It's not spoilable. The North's railroads, in large part, it's part of its industry, which centers up here in New England, right? But part of it is agriculture that is perishable agriculture. Tomatoes, cucumber, all these things, fresh fruits and vegetables, excuse me, that you've got to move quickly, otherwise they spoil and they're no good. Cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, those are the primary commodities of the South prior to the Civil War. None of those, well, rice is one of those things that they jokingly call it an almost immortal food, that as long as you keep it dry and you don't let insects get in, you don't let vermin get in, rice can be good for decades, literally decades. And then all those other commodities aren't edible. Okay, cotton, indigo, which is a blue dye, which is why the Union uniforms are blue, why it's the cheapest dye in the country. Tobacco, again, as long as you keep it dry, don't let it get wet, that's fine. There's a fifth one, and I'm forgetting what the fifth one is. There's always big five for the South.
Alcohol.
No, not necessarily.
Also, I said, look at like one ship called the MSC Oscar has a capacity of 1,100 747s.
Okay, so in that modern context, we're talking about tankers. Absolutely. So there you go. So all the commodities they have in the South are not expirable commodities. If it takes it a month to get there, why pay all the money to build all this rails when you could just put it out? And the South also has a lot of good rivers. You can really only see the Ohio and the Mississippi here on this map, but there's a good river, much better river system in the South than there's in the North. So they throw it on a barge, and it goes down the river, eventually usually winding up in New Orleans when it comes to like cotton. Though there are Wilmington and Norfolk and Charleston are also big shipping ports. But again, it's not perishable, so we're not in a rush. So why spend millions of dollars to build an infrastructure for stuff that can take an extra month? Who cares if it takes longer for cotton to get there, or indigo, or whatever? Doesn't matter. So, let's go back to the Army. I wanted to set those things up so you get a feel for what's going on with the country in general, and all of those things are going to relate back to the Army and what the Army's doing at this time. Now, again, we're post-War of 1812, but pre-Civil War. Okay, so we're in that 45-year slot there. The Army at this point, there's a question about their mission. What is the Army's mission? Remember, we're huge already. We've got the Louisiana Purchase. So in theory, we go all the way to the Pacific coast, though you remember Oregon Territory, what is today Washington, Oregon, and part of Utah, part of Idaho, is still under dispute with the British. They claim they own it, we claim we own it, regardless. So we've got that problem, okay? We've got the Oregon Territory, which is a source of conflict. Again, we're used to thinking of Canada as our kind of friendly neighbor. I was trying to make a sarcastic comment, but thank you for not letting me do that. You saved me from myself. But our friendly neighbor to the north, who, you know, their major export is the beer they don't like, because, by the way, they don't drink a lot of the Canadian beers that we drink here. Actually, Canadians don't like. So that I found that out when I had several Canadian friends. You know, like I'd say these different Canadian brands, like, oh, we don't drink that up north. That we make that for you guys. Make that to ship down to you guys. And maple syrup and wood. I mean, that's kind of their exports. They are part of the British Empire, and Britain is our enemy. And again, our attitude toward Britain really doesn't start to change till World War I, and the modern attitude of Britain being a close ally, that's World War II to the present. So that's relatively recent in American history. Throughout most of our history, the British are the enemies. Okay? We are, in essence, empire building. The whole of the western frontier. How much of a role should the army have in that? That's a question. Nobody has a distinct answer. The army is so small, quite frankly, they don't have much role. But whenever something goes bad, the attitude is, well, why wasn't the army here to protect us from the Indians or whatever? And the army's reaction is, well, tell your congressman to vote us a bigger budget and maybe we can do that. But until then, no. I mean, the entire army is something like 12, 15,000 guys at this time. Active duty army, okay? It's tiny. There is the question of clearing Indians out of certain areas and security, but the army isn't very good at it, partly because they never have a written doctrine, and partly because they're just so dang on small. There's also still some tension over the civilian/military leadership. Who's really running the show? I'm not talking about like a coup or anything. Again, the Newburgh conspiracy that we talked about briefly is the only example of attempted coup in American history. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the Army's attitude is these civilians don't know how to run our organization. We should be the ones to run the organization. We'll do whatever we're told, like at a major policy level, but on a day-to-day, we need to be running it. Well, please.
So sorry, I just a reminder that coup was when the Northeastern.
No, that wasn't a military coup. That was a state coup, you could say. That was the Hartford Convention. That was where the Federalists said, we want out of the War of 1812, even though we're the idiots who wanted into the War of 1812. Yeah, that was a different one. No, that Newburgh conspiracy was where those Revolutionary Army officers said we're going to overthrow Congress, and Washington went and talked to them, and he gave that speech where by the end they were all in tears and they quietly file out of the room because they respect Washington so much. So that's another problem, is leadership. The civilian leadership doesn't know anything about the military, and they're rotating, which we still deal with it every day. Every civilian government does, is every 2 to 4 years, somebody new is in charge, and they're gonna have a different attitude toward it. Let's be honest though, the military leadership in this early era isn't very competent either. Because again, we don't have any kind of training facilities. We've just founded West Point, like 13 years earlier. So we don't have a whole bunch of educated people. There's no master's level institutions like we have now with the Command and General Staff College or the War College. Those don't exist. So honestly, the leadership even within the military kind of sucks. Okay, they can march a unit around. They know how to do that, but like think about big policy, like what should we be doing for as a country? They're worthless. Please.
I don't know if this is the right time, but isn't this also the time in which they're having issues because everyone who fought in the American Revolution had like a power job position was dying out, and now there was just blank positions?
Yeah, well, you're right. You're losing experience in essence, is what you're saying. So all the people who had the most experience with the revolution, by this point, they're all gone. They'd all be They'd all be really old by this point, so they're not in active duty anymore. Now, we did get a fresh batch of experience during the War of 1812, but that, remember, was kind of a mixed bag. Like, the guys invaded Canada 3 times, I don't know if I want to put those guys in charge since they failed 3 times. Andrew Jackson's around, but gosh, that guy's kind of a hothead and a jerk. I don't know that I want to put him in charge. You know, so even there, when we've got experience, and we'll talk about who we're going to have to pick from, because there are 2 models we're going to have to pick from when it comes to senior leadership, but we'll do that in a second here, okay? A lot of what the Army's doing in this earlier period is exploring and map making. There used to be a separate branch in the Army called the Corps of Topographical Engineers. Their full-time job was just making maps. And even though they were absorbed in the rest of the Engineer Corps later on, that function of the Army Corps of Engineers lasts into the Cold War. It's not until we get all these satellites and everything that we have accurate maps all the time where you could just... I have a buddy who was an Air Force intelligence officer back in the 90s. And I remember him telling me, you can get better maps on Google Earth right now on your phone than we could in the 90s. The top secret maps. The best maps the Air Force had in the world weren't as good as what you can get on your phone right now. Okay, that's how much that technology has changed the way we do map making and all that kind of stuff. So, and I remember him saying that, and I thought, oh, come on, it was the Cold War. We had all, he goes, no, the technology is so much better. Yeah, we had the best thing at the time, but he says the satellites, the resolution they can get, where they can like pick out people, he says, we could hardly ever do that. So again, map making was huge. Now we're kind of spoiled in that we've got GPS systems, we've got all this, and we can just, that was a major function of the Army for centuries, literally. Internal improvements, again, the Army Corps of Engineers is frequently put to work building dams, building roads, surveying. Former Army officers are frequently, once railroads become a thing, a guy will go into the Army, he'll do 4 or 5 years, he'll quit, he's a trained engineer. So he immediately goes to one of the railroads, gets a job making 5 to 10 times what he made in the Army, and now he's responsible for planning out the railroads, how those go. So there was a book written a few years ago about West Point graduates who are famous for stuff that has nothing to do with the military. And he just went through all these West Pointers who were engineers, doctors, lawyers, all these different things. And engineers was the biggest section of the book, as you can imagine, because until 1980-something, every single graduate of West Point had a degree in engineering. You didn't have a choice. There was some point in the 80s where they switched it and said, okay, you can have a major other than engineering. And even then, you had the equivalent of a minor in engineering, whether you wanted it or not, because the mandatory classes were such that, I mean, so I started college when Ronald Reagan was still president. I never even for a moment thought about going to West Point, even though I wanted to be in the Army, because I don't do math. It's just, and my former students who've had me more than once know, if there's math involved, you better get your calculator out and check Dr. B out, because there's a good chance he got it wrong if he's thinking, if it's not in his slide, if it comes out of his mouth, get that calculator. Nope, that's not right. Okay, so again, that's a big deal. The internal improvements, West Pointers and Army officers in general are very heavily involved in these internal American improvements. Okay? Enforcing trade regulations. You might say, what? The Army was doing that? Yeah. There was no Borders and Customs Service or whatever the heck we call that. None of that existed, guys. So trade with Mexico and trade with Canada was regulated by the United States Army. Out at sea, we have the Coast Guard. It wasn't called the Coast Guard yet. It was called the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service. So they took care of along the coast. But if it was internal, land-wise, so Canada and Mexico, that was the Army that had to regulate it. And quite frankly, most of it they never even saw. It was so easy to smuggle stuff in those days. So easy to smuggle stuff across from Mexico or from Canada. Because look at the size of the border. The entire Army is like 12,000 guys. Yeah, no one's gonna notice you coming over with a load of maple syrup or whatever you're coming over with. It's not gonna happen, okay? And then the question of how should the Army be composed? Who should be in the Army? How should the Army be organized? How many men are necessary?
Well, like 30.
That's a constant debate, right? I mean, today it's a debate. Then it's even bigger debate. And the answer is always not many, because we're not paying for it. So the army is always perpetually small. We build up during a war, and the minute the war's over, okay, you guys can go home. That whole citizen soldier concept, which in principle I totally agree with. I totally agree with that in principle. But you gotta have enough of an army to be able to protect yourself. And quite frankly, we almost never do. The Navy is usually a little bit better only because the amount of capital that has to go into building ships, you can't build a Navy, except for World War II, when we actually managed to build an entire Navy in 5 years. The best Navy in the world in 5 years. We started with nothing, built the best Navy in 5 years. But with the exception of World War II, you need some lead time. I can't just churn out ships tomorrow. I can draft an army, they're gonna suck, but I can draft a bunch of guys and say, here's your uniform, here's your rifle, you're in the army. Can't do that with the Navy. I gotta build ships. I have to have shipyard facilities, I have to have resources, I have to have material, I have to have manpower who's skilled, because you can't just hand a guy a hammer and nails and have him build a boat, a ship, okay? So the Navy generally is a little better off in peacetime, just a little. And they get better during the war, and the minute the war is over, we either mothball or sell off a good chunk of the Navy, until we get to the Steel Navy. This is the wood Navy I'm talking about, okay? When we get to the Steel Navy, you can't sell somebody a destroyer to use as a cargo vessel. That doesn't work, okay? So that'll fundamentally change how things work for the Navy, but that's later. And lastly, funding, and the funding always sucks. The main reason the funding sucks is, here, trivia, all right? Before I'm gonna get the date wrong, but it's about 1906. Prior to 1906, how did the United States government get almost all of its funding? The federal government, not the state government, federal government. Tariffs. Import-export taxes. There was no income tax until about 1906. I might be off by a couple of years there. There's no income tax. It's the 17th Amendment? 13, 14, 15, that's Civil War, that deals with African American civil rights. 16, 17, 19th is women's rights. So it's somewhere between the 16th and 18th. I don't have that right on my immediate recall, but one of those three amendments allows the federal income tax. We had tried to have a federal income tax during the Civil War. I'll talk about that later. It gets struck down by the Supreme Court. It says that's unconstitutional. So we have to have a separate constitutional amendment to get a national income tax. Now individual states had already had income taxes. Not everyone, some had, okay? Because that was a state-to-state thing. But at the federal government level, it was different. And tariffs are the main way we pay for everything. Well, you can imagine that's not a lot of money.
Did you say 1906?
I want to say
Or
about
1806?
No, about 1906.
1906.
Yeah, it's either the 16th, 17th, or 18th Amendment.
It's the
16.
Okay, guys, the 16th Amendment. What year? Was that close?
1909.
Okay, I was off by 3. Okay, I bracketed that. Okay. So, again, it's impossible to fund everything you want. Okay. Now, we can certainly say in the modern era, government's gone insane the other way, and they spend money they don't even have and don't give a damn. Okay? I don't think this is a left-right thing. I think everybody who's a reasonable person, regardless of which side of the political spectrum they fall on, say, we should probably not spend money we don't have. I'm not saying on what, I'm not saying, I'm not picking programs, I'm just saying don't spend money you don't have. That's probably a reasonable thing. Again, whether you're on one end or the other of the political spectrum, let's have a tax, and then whatever that tax is, that's what you get to spend, nothing more. Unless it's like a world war and you got an emergency fund. So, anyway. So, these are all the problems that the Army's going to deal with in this pre-Civil War era, and problems and or missions that they're going to have to deal with. And none of them are going to get any easier. None of them are magically going to fix themselves. They're going to be a perpetual problem, because quite frankly, a lot of these are still problems after the Civil War and into the 20th century in some cases. So, now, the General James Wilkinson is what we would call today the Chief of Staff. In those days, he was called the General-in-Chief or Commanding General of the Army. I'll explain more about that later, but basically what we have now is the head of the Army, the military head of the Army, doesn't actually command the Army. Okay? So the current Chief of Staff is Milley. General Milley does not actually get to lead troops in battle. His job is to be in Washington, making sure all the pieces, parts are functioning correctly. In those days, the head of the Army is actually expected to get on a horse and lead the Army, which is
a frontline general.
Yes, which is a crazy way to run things. So how can you make sure funding is getting and all this stuff is being done while you're off on a battlefield? It's not the way you should do things, but we're still young, we're learning, okay? So James Wilkinson is the commanding general, general-in-chief, whatever the heck you want to call him at this time, all right? And he kind of embodies a lot of the issues that are wrong with the Army at that time. So let's talk about some of these. There is very little professional education. I kind of mentioned that already. West Point's only, 13 years old or something like that at this point, right after the War of 1812. So all the people who've gone to West Point they're all young. They're all young guys. They're not in senior command positions. And on top, oh please, I'm sorry. West Point started admitting women with the class of 1980, I think. So they entered in the fall of 76. I might be off by a year there. Yeah, women were not admitted to West Point until after we got rid of the draft. Because the draft, we had a situation where the draft was considered, in those days, every West Point graduate had to be an infantryman, armor, field artillery, had to be combat arms. You couldn't be a signals guy, adjutant general, any of those other jobs. You couldn't do those. You had to be combat arms. So the rationale was women don't serve in the combat arms, therefore they don't need to go to West Point. And when we dropped the draft, that changed the attitude a lot toward the Army. Like, okay, we're not in Vietnam anymore. We left Vietnam, and so should we fundamentally change all our institutions? And West Point was one of those institutions that was undergoing a change at that time, mostly for the better. I mean, I think they did some boneheaded things too, but mostly for the better because they started saying, yeah, you could be a West Pointer and be a Signal Corps officer or something else. Or then not long after that, they're going to say, you can major in something other than engineering, which again, you could be a smart person generally and not be good with math, I'm hoping. Because otherwise I'm not very smart. But so, you're losing people who could be really good, really successful people because they're not good with math. I'm simplifying, but you get what I'm saying. So West Point started saying, okay, no, we should embrace these other things, and so that's when it changed. So anyway, so I hope that answers your question. Yeah. So very little professional education. No Command and General Staff College, that won't be founded until 1881. No War College, that won't be founded until 1904. Okay, so for about a century, more than a century, you got a commission, very often not from West Point, and you learned how to be a soldier by being a soldier, on-the-job training. There are some good aspects to that, certainly. I'm very critical of West Point and a lot of the things West Point does. I think they created unrealistic environment. They create this kind of, almost monastery-like environment there in New York, where they live in this perfect little world where no one lies, cheats, steals, or tolerates those who do, and all that. And I think they're ill-preparing those guys to be in the real Army where people lie, cheat, and steal all the time, and you gotta be able to function in that world. So, but if I gotta go to one extreme or the other, like no education at all, or that kind of stilted West Point model, I'll actually take the West Point model over nothing.
Like I was saying, everyone's a thief. There's only one thief. Everyone's just trying to everyone else is just trying to get their stuff back.
Right. There you go. Exactly. So, what else? There's no standards for entry into the Army or for promotion in this early Army. So for enlisted people, it's just, I need a warm body, and you're willing to volunteer, so I'll take you. You know, you're generally healthy. You're not like missing a limb or something, or an eye. All right, good, we'll take you. How do you get promoted to corporal or sergeant? Well, you stick around for long enough. One of the other corporals and sergeants gets promoted, dies, something like that, and the senior people like you. That's it. That's the standard. You could be an idiot, but you toady up to that sergeant, he's going to make you a corporal. No one. I wasn't directing that at you because you were a corporal, but
Right.
you see where I'm going. You know, you're always brown nosing up to that sergeant, and then the other corporal dies, leaves, whatever. I want that guy, you know, because there's no system. And look, that still happens, right? To some degree, not to the extreme degree, but that still happens. But it's been toned down by having requirements and policies and things like that. Okay. Likewise with officers in this early era, because again, West Point is so new, very few people are going, you okay? Are going to West Point. You get to be an officer by, if you're the right kind of class of person, like, you know, you're among the gentry in the South, you know, your dad's a plantation owner. If you want a commission, dad's gonna write the congressman, and the congressman's gonna take care of that for you, okay? In the North, if your dad's wealthy, like an industrialist, you know, owns a factory or something, and you want to do it, they'll get it done for you, okay? And then again, promotion, like with the enlisted ranks, the officer ranks, there are guys who will spend decades as lieutenants, the lowest rank of officer. Guys will literally spend, not because they're incompetent, just because they didn't get along with the right person, they didn't, what have you. It's just a chaotic system. In fact, even as late as the 20th century, Dwight Eisenhower, who will eventually be one of only five-star generals in American history, spent 15 years as a major. 15 years. Majors are in the modern Army, 5 to 7 years. He spent 15 years as a major. So, people come into the service for a few years, do some service, leave the service, then later come back. Now, why is that? Well, the pay sucks, the job sucks, and there's no incentives. There's no retirement system. In fact, I might be stealing, for all I know, the next bullet is no retirement system. But there's no retirement system, there's no disability system, there's no VA, Veterans Administration, Department of Veterans Affairs, that doesn't exist. Okay, so, yeah, I mean, the only reason you go into the service is because you really, really like it, or you can't find anything else to do. That's why people did it in this early era, because there's no real reason to stay in. So people come in, they go out, they come back in. You see that a lot in this early pre-Civil War period, which it seems strange to us, but it did happen. When it comes to officers especially, officers don't solely see themselves as a member of the officer corps. Over time, professional officers, the ones who stay in, see themselves as a servant of the nation. In fact, there used to be a tradition prior to the Vietnam War that if you were a regular officer, you were a professional officer, you did not vote. Because voting implied you preferred one political party over the other, and that was considered disloyal to the nation. Now, I think that might be a little extreme, but I see the logic of it. You shouldn't be picking sides. You serve the nation, whether it's run by the Democrats or run by the Republicans, run by the Federalists or run by the Democratic Republicans, run by the Whigs. It doesn't matter. Okay? Dwight Eisenhower, again, Eisenhower, the first time he voted in his life was when he voted for himself for president in 1952. He was born in 1889. So he was 64 years old. He never voted. Because again, he was a servant of the nation. And it didn't matter whether the Democrats or the Republicans were running it, he was a servant of the nation. That's the way he saw himself. And that, again, I see there being something noble to that. I think it's a little extreme to never vote, but I see that. Now, the problem is, in this early era, it was the opposite. It was very partisan. You didn't see yourself as an officer. You saw yourself as a Virginian who happen to be serving in the US Army, but my first loyalty is Virginia, or Illinois, or Indiana, or after the Mexican War, Texas. And that's problematic. And you can see where that's going to go with the Civil War, when your first loyalty isn't to the nation, but to your home state. So that's, again, that's problematic. I kind of already mentioned this. Often, especially when it comes to officers, they're politically appointed. You knew the right people, you get in. You know who to talk to. Your dad's powerful, your dad's wealthy, your uncle, cousin, what have you, you're going to get the job. You'll see a little teeny tiny bit of that still in the National Guard, but it's not what it was in the old days. I was in the Guard in Indiana, or no, Ohio when I lived there. We drilled in Indiana, so that's why I lost track of there for a second. But yeah, there was a little bit of that, but it wasn't like this, where you could literally just become a colonel because you knew something. I was a second lieutenant, that's where you started. Okay. And lastly, again, as I kind of already said, there's little self-identity with the nation. You're not identifying with the nation, you're still a Texan, an Indianian? A Hoosier, okay? A Hoosier, an Ohioan, etc. That's your first loyalty. Now, there are three men who I'm going to argue to you help to change this model, help to create a professional army that eventually does a good job for about 100 years. Post that, we'll talk about later. Three men, one is a soldier, one is a politician, well actually two are soldiers, one is a politician. And they're going to help fix this situation, all right? So, education has to be the first thing, educational standards, all right? So, the first man I want to talk about is named Sylvanus Thayer, okay? Sylvanus Thayer is the first of these three guys who's going to be really important. And what is Sylvanus Thayer famous for? He was the superintendent of the United States Military Academy, i.e. West Point, for, 16 years, okay? He was the superintendent of the United States Military Academy for 16 years. Now, when he arrived, as late as 1817, so the Academy had been founded in 1802, so it had been around for 15 years, there was no established standards or anything at West Point. There were guys who had been there for 7 years and had still not graduated. There were guys who would be there as little as a year or two and graduate. Okay, so clearly there's something wrong here. Okay? So one of the first things he says is this is going to be a 4-year program. Now, I'm not suggesting he invented this. Universities had already established a roughly 4-year system prior to that. But what he does is say, look, that's what we should do. We are a university, we just don't call ourselves that. We have to treat this as Harvard or Yale, because remember, there weren't that many colleges in those days, so Harvard and Yale weren't just the elite, they were some of the only colleges in America, okay? So we have to establish the standard just like universities and colleges do. 4 years, please.
Is this when the goat tradition begins?
The goat, I would have to look that up exactly when the goat begins, but I want to say it's about 1818. The goat, okay, she's asking a question. The goat is the person who graduates last in the class, but still graduates. So they're considered the class goat. And there was a tradition, and interesting enough, you asked about when women entered. This is a tradition that went away when women entered. And the reason is, so you would be ranked constantly, not like once a year, not once a semester, like constantly, there'd be an order, what's called the Order of Merit. So the person who has the best scores on everything, down to the worst. And people were constantly looking, they'd post it, like once a week, they'd post it, and you'd look for your name where you are on this list. And the guy at the bottom is the goat. And if you survived and actually graduated, because very frequently guys who were goats 1 week were gone a few weeks later because they failed something. But if you managed to graduate, but you're at the very bottom, they had a tradition where one everybody in the class would contribute $1 apiece, and they would give this guy the $1 apiece because he's gonna need it, because he's clearly not very bright. So here's your bag of money that we're giving you, because you're gonna need all the help you can get for the rest of your life. Obviously, the guy has a college education in an era in which literacy is like 50%, so he's doing okay. But it was the joke that you're so not very bright, so here's your bag of money to help you because you're not going to make it very well in this world. Okay. Interestingly enough, when women came, they eliminated the order of merit for fear that if the women were at the bottom, Congress would get involved and say, "What are you doing? Why are the women not at the top of the order of merit all the time?" And so the tradition went away. Now, I've talked to West Pointers who said informally there is still a goat. People kind of know who the goat is, and informally they know, and they still do the dollar tradition, but they're not allowed to officially do it. It used to be part of graduation. It used to be part of the graduation ceremony where they would literally hand you a bag of money. Because the last guy would come up, there'd be huge, everyone stand, they'd cheer, because this guy managed to actually survive and get through, and then he would shake hands, get his diploma, and then someone would hand him a bag of money. So I've heard that it officially still does exist, but they don't include it in the ceremony anymore, because if the goat ever were a woman, Congress would say, "Oh, how dare you, you're belittling women," when that's not what it is. It's a long-standing tradition. But yes, they had, I think 1818 is the first class that had a goat. Also important to understand, some of the early classes, the very first class had 2 graduates. So we're not talking hundreds of thousands of people. These early classes, 20, 30, 40, 50 people is all they're graduating per year. They're tiny. Anyway, so I think it's 1818. I'm not positive about that, but I think it's 1818. And officially it's discontinued with the class of 1979 being the last class that has that, because it was the last class that was all male. Even though women were at the academy, that was the last class where there were no women in that class. It starts starting with 80. Officially it doesn't exist, but unofficially it does. That's what I've heard from West Pointers. Anyway, okay, regular examinations. So prior to Thayer getting there, that, like I said, it was very much, the comparison I was making is it's very much more like a European system prior to Thayer getting there. In European universities, historically, I don't know what they do now, okay, but as late as the 1980s, I knew 2 girls, one of whom I went to grammar school with. She and I were in grammar school together. And she and her sister went to the University of Bologna in Italy. They were Italian, their parents were immigrants, and they decided to go to the University of Bologna in Italy. I don't know how they managed to finagle that. I can't even imagine trying to go to school in another country. They spoke fluent Italian, so. They would just go to lectures. Like there'd be an announcement, Professor Giovanni is giving a lecture on medieval physics. And you just go to lecture, not go to lecture. And then at the end of 4 years, there was an examination process, and you'd go and you'd sit for exams. And if you passed the exams, you got your bachelor's degree. And if you didn't pass your exams, you didn't get your bachelor's degree. And in fact, the older of the 2 sisters, Liz, who I was good friends with and still am, I see her on Facebook, she had ticked off some of the professors. I don't know what she did. She was a very confrontational person, and she still is. And she had ticked some professors off, and she failed her exams. So after 4 years at the University of Bologna, she had nothing. I don't know if she ever got a bachelor's, honestly, because she had to come home with, there's no transfer credits. Because again, it wasn't in those days regular courses. It was just, you attended lectures. So she couldn't like show a transcript, like, oh, here are the classes I took, I only need to take 10 more to graduate. She had nothing. So quite frankly, I never wanted to broach the subject because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. It was like, did you ever get a bachelor's in the end? But, so that was how it was at West Point. You'd show up for lectures, and at a certain point, we do like final exams for 4 years, and if you pass the exams, congratulations, you're now a 2nd lieutenant, here's your diploma. You didn't pass the exams, you got kicked out. But some guys would know they weren't going to pass, so they just kept staying and staying and staying. Like I said, I think the record in those days was one guy was there for 7 years, and he never took the exams because he didn't think he could pass. So Thayer said, no, every semester you are taking exams and you're taking regular classes, and if you don't pass the exams, you're out of here. Nobody's sticking around for 7 years just kind of fooling around, doing a whole bunch of nothing. It's not going to happen. He is also the one that says, we were founded, Thomas Jefferson approved the foundation of this school as an engineering school. But for the last 15 years, nobody's been really pushing that, okay? We're pushing it now. We're an engineering school. Everybody who graduates from this place is gonna be a trained engineer. You can't hack it, get out. That's his attitude about almost everything. Thayer is a real hard man. He just does not brook any nonsense, okay? He creates the order of merit, which I mentioned, which is later on it was like every week, but in those days it was at least once a semester. There's the rankings of everybody in the class, and you can see where you are, and everybody else sees. So this becomes one of those psychological things, guys, where, I mean, nowadays it would be considered an invasion of privacy and everything, but there was some good to everybody knowing how you were doing, because it forced you in a lot of cases to work harder. I don't want to be at the bottom of the class, okay? I want to be higher up, and so it forced guys to work harder. There's a disciplinary system that's instituted. That's one of the other things about early West Point, prior to Thayer. These guys were in uniform. In theory, they're part of the Army, but their day-to-day behavior is like a bunch of fraternity reports. That's probably the best way I could say it. They're playing pranks on people, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. There's like, no, you're in the Army, we're paying you, you're wearing your uniform, you're gonna behave like the men in the units I commanded. That's how you're gonna behave. And unfortunately, that disciplinary system goes to excesses, and it's not really until the 1970s, 80s until they start reining it back. The disciplinary system is so rigid that you had, during the first year as a cadet, what's called the plebe year, you had guys literally losing weight to the point where they were almost starving, because when you ate meals as a group, and the junior guy at the table serves the senior guys at the table. So every time that junior guy is about to take a bite, I need some more coffee. The junior guy would get up, and you only have 30 minutes to eat. So this guy would get like 2 bites and then have to go back to the barracks and not get any food until the next day. And so you had guys literally passing out because they weren't. So the disciplinary system gets too rigid with a lot of hazing and a lot of stuff like that. And it gets so bad that Congress gets involved, and then the academy starts pulling back a little, and then when women get in, that's like, okay, nope, we're not having that. So now, compared to our regular society, the discipline system is still very rigid, but compared to what it was as late as the 60s or 70s, it's very mild, okay? So that's what I'll say about it. I personally think that the system that used to exist was excessive and abusive. When you have guys would drink, you know what Brasso is? Brasso is a polish for polishing brass, because in the old days it wasn't permanent shine, everything, you had to polish your own brass. Guys would drink Brasso to get themselves sick so they could go into the hospital for a few days, because in the hospital they'd be fed meals and nobody would try and take their food away. That's how bad the system was prior. So I think it's a good thing we got rid of that. I think that's excessive. When you have guys who are literally starving, that's not good.
Did anybody die?
To my knowledge, no one ever died, but there's a lot of guys who resigned because it was so bad, or has to be hospitalized because it was so bad. And again, it was an abusive system, in my opinion. He creates, so he's the superintendent. He is in essence the president of the university, you want to think of it like that. He then creates an office called the commandant, who is basically like the dean of students. Okay, that's how I would make this comparison. So it's like he's the president of the university, but I got a lot of things to worry about. So I'm going to create another office called the office of the commandant, who's actually in charge of the day-to-day running of the place, so I can have the big picture about how the institution as a whole is going. And they still have that office to this day. The commandant, there is still a commandant at West Point. And in the modern era, they now have a dean underneath the commandant, so that there's the commandant, and then there's a dean of arts and sciences, dean of engineering. So it's more like a regular university. So in the modern day, we'd probably say this is more like a provost or like a senior vice president. But back in the day, this is the equivalent of the dean, because he's handling the day-to-day operations of the university, or the academy. he creates an academic board. So what this is as a group, the faculty get together, the senior faculty get together and decide what should we be teaching? How should our curriculum be structured for a 4-year program? What are the subjects we should be getting to first? What is the all those things that we take for granted in a university. You should take 101 or 1305 in our case, okay, before you take this class, right? That's what the academics board's job is. Every year, review the curriculum, decide what courses are working, what courses are not working, where should we move them, should we take this course before this course, all those kinds of things. So this is the senior faculty of the academy meet frequently to do this. And again, that might sound like a duh thing to you because we're used to an era in which that happens all the time. He's one of the first people who's saying, hey, we got to think about these things. And then last but not least, he creates the board of visitors. And the board of visitors is senior faculty and administrators from places like Harvard and Yale and the College of William and Mary and these places who come in, look at what the academic board, the commandant, and the superintendent are doing and say, well, look, we're not going to tell you how to run the military stuff. We don't know how to do that. But we can tell you academically, you're screwed up 6 ways to Sunday. Okay? Here's how you've got to fix this. And so that's a huge shot in the arm for the academy because now it means they are de facto being endorsed by Harvard, Yale, Princeton, William and Mary. All these big falutin universities are now saying, we recognize this is a legitimate school. That any graduate of this university, of this college, this university, whatever you want to call it, is equivalent to a graduate of our schools. And to this day, if you graduate from West Point, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, the Coast Guard Academy, you graduate from one of those places, and you decide to leave the military, recruiters will come after you like you're a Harvard graduate or a Yale graduate or a Princeton graduate. Those are considered Ivy League equivalent schools. And so you can kind of write your own ticket. When you read about, in the more modern era, when you read about guys like when they leave West Point, what do? They all can either get senior positions in other places like that, easily get into graduate programs if they want to go to law school or something like that. It's a snap. And again, you know, where the rest of us have to claw for a place in one of these institutions. I just finished reading a book called The Long Gray Line, which is about the class of 1966 from West Point. And a number of these guys in the 70s got out. They were in Vietnam. They said, I'm done. I don't want anything more to do with this. They get out. And they're all going to law school at the University of Michigan, Harvard, all these other, and I'm going, okay, I heard about how these guys were as students. They weren't that good as students. But because they got the prestige of being from West Point, they can get into these universities that I could never have gotten into. But it's a snap because, oh, you went to West Point. Oh, okay, that's like going to Harvard. Oh, cool. You could, yeah, University of Michigan, we'll take it. I applied to Ohio State, couldn't get in. I applied to A&M, couldn't get in for graduate school. I applied, the list of schools that wouldn't have anything to do with me is quite long. But these guys, they could just walk in like nothing. So, very different. So Thayer deserves a lot of credit because he takes West Point from this kind of wishy-washy kind of nothing place where people spend most of their time just fooling around into a legitimate academic institution. When he leaves in 1833, West Point is a respected institution in the United States already. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't detractors who hated West Point. To this day, there are people who say we should abolish all the academies and just spend that money on ROTC scholarships to wherever people want to go. You want to be in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps? That's fine. We'll give you a Navy ROTC scholarship, an Air Force ROTC scholarship, an Army ROTC scholarship, and we'll send you to a civil university. It'll cost us a fraction of the money. We could use it better. There are people who say that today. I think that's a bit over the top. I think there is some goodness at the academies. I think there's some stupidity at the academies as well, but I think there's some goodness. So. Anyway, so Sylvanus Thayer is the first of these three guys who's going to make a major impact on the 19th century army, okay? But it's going to take a while until these graduates become generals, and then everyone goes, oh man. Because Thayer, when he leaves under a cloud, because so many people hate him because of all the things he's done, you know, the rigidity and all that, that when he leaves to just go back to being an engineer officer, because that's what he was trained as an engineer, like nobody's shedding a tear. It's kind of like, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And it won't be until the Civil War when the majority of the successful Army officers are West Point graduates that people are going to go, oh wow, maybe Thayer actually had something right there. But for the next 30 years, he's just kind of, he's a colonel who's doing engineering stuff and nobody could care. Nobody could care less. All right, so that was the first guy. Now, that's the education thing. Now, let's talk about leadership. The two leadership models that are put out for us in this period are two guys with famous nicknames. The first is Old Hickory. Anybody remember who Old Hickory was? I mentioned him last time. Jackson, Andrew Jackson, right? Old Hickory. He's called Old Hickory because he's hard as hickory wood, which is one of the hardest woods. There's no doubt about that. Now the other one gets the nickname, this isn't a good nickname. Old Hickory, I would like to be nicknamed Old Hickory. I would not like to be nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers, okay? And this is a nickname he did not, no one said to his face, that said behind his back. So the two models are Andrew Jackson on the one hand, and Winfield Scott on the other hand, okay? So Jackson you already kind of know about. I'll give you a little spiel about him. He's kind of a self-made man. Literally goes from nothing to being the equivalent of a millionaire. Ruthless general, absolutely ruthless general. Later president, fairly ruthless president too.
Shot multiple times.
Shot multiple times, has a hunk of lead sitting right next to his heart from one of the times where a surgeon won't operate on him because he said, I'm not taking a chance on killing you, okay? Pretty virulent racist, and again, I don't throw that word around. I'm not somebody who, I believe in using words appropriately and not calling everybody a certain, you know, everybody's not a Nazi or a communist, okay? He really is. And even by the standards of the time, he was considered, like I said, there are people who owned slaves who went, God, Andrew Jackson, what a racist jerk.
Virulent racist,
Yeah,
but adopted an Indian child.
but
A real
then
enigma.
Yeah, he's an enigma in that sense. He does adopt an Indian child, it's true. His adopted son was Indian, even though he loathes Indians, absolutely hates them.
Well,
and we'll talk about what he does as president,
Did
please.
he actually care about the child, or was the child basically just a mascot to him?
From what I can tell, he actually kind of cared about the kid. So I just don't, he's complicated. We're all complicated, all right? Whenever you try and reduce things down and because you don't like something about somebody, you label them a thing like a commie or a Nazi or whatever, you lose the fact that we're all nuanced. There's certain things I'm sure that I would say, if I talked about my personal beliefs, that half of you would agree with and the other half would think I was either a Nazi or a commie. So again, people are always nuanced. There's always more to it than that, but there's not a lot of nuance in Jackson. That's one of the few nuances. Like, he loved his wife. He was absolutely devoted to his wife, and his adopted child was a Native American who we cared about. So there's two nice things I can say about him.
Oh, here's a fun fact.
You can find a third thing we can say nice about him?
Oh no, it's about his son. It was actually about his adopted son, and he did care and educated himself and wanted to send him to West Point, but that proved like very difficult because
Because he was an Indian.
yeah, unfortunately he died at 19 due to tuberculosis.
He says he's okay with Native Americans as long as they abandon their beliefs and assimilate into the American culture.
But as we talked about, then he does that thing to the Cherokees, who had assimilated into the American culture. So,
It's confusing, but
I guess they didn't assimilate good
Enough.
for his liking.
yeah, for his standards, I guess that wasn't enough assimilation.
although I did hear that he was not particularly pleased over the brutalities, he did nothing to stop it. So it's sort of a
Again, anyway, so that's Jackson on the other hand. So Jackson's a self-made man. So he hated West Point, by the way. When he's president, he tries to kill West Point a number of times. This is an elite. This is creating an elite. This is creating an aristocracy in America. We don't want that. We're all about small r republicanism. We don't want an elite. We don't want aristocracy. The other hand, we have Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is from a wealthy group of Virginia planters. He actually went to the College of William and Mary, which, by the way, is the oldest university in the country. Everyone always forgets that. They always think it's Harvard or Yale. It's actually William and Mary is the oldest university in the country. He attends for like 1 year, and then he joins the Army in 1809 as a lieutenant, because he knows the right people, he can get connections, right? He will go from in 1809, he is a second lieutenant. In 1814, 5 years later, he's a general. Okay? He's a general 5 years later. He fights exceedingly well. He is an example of a guy who, despite a lack of military education, figures stuff out and does quite well. So I don't mean to mock him in that sense. That is a meteoric rise, but it's justified in this case. He is a really good leader. Okay? Now I'm going to forget the date. In 1840, I think it's 1840, he becomes General-in-Chief of the United States Army. He holds that position until 1861. He is the longest serving General-in-Chief of the United States Army in American history. It's over a little over 20 years. He's General-in-Chief. All right? So again, smart man. He really does succeed. It's not political connections. Political connections get him in the Army, but his success is due to himself. He believes in West Point. He believes in education. He speaks fluent French, speaks and reads fluent French. And so at one point, the Army sends him to Europe to observe some battles. And he collects all the stuff he can get, like their French manuals and German manuals and all that, brings it back. They translate a bunch of them. So he's, again, a smart, articulate, thoughtful man. Now, he also happens to be a jerk, too. Okay? And the reason he's called Old Fuss and Feathers is because he's always fussing about something. Oh, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right. You know, he's very much a perfectionist. And the feathers come from, in those days, general officers legally could design their own uniforms, which is the most insane thing I've ever heard. But they could design their own uniforms. And if you notice, he really likes gold braid and that kind of stuff. And this particular hat doesn't seem to have a feather in it, but evidently one of his hats had this like ostrich feather in it, or peacock feather, one of these like feathers that's like this long. And people just kind of had to do the, I'm not gonna laugh, oh gosh, that's funny. And so that's where he gets the nickname, because he's always fussing about something, something's wrong, and then on the other hand, he's wearing these uniforms that look like they're costumes in a Gilbert and Sullivan opera or something like that. So that's where he gets his nickname. And again, it's not intended to be a flattering nickname. It's not Old Hickory. And the Army is presented, the nation is presented with which model are we going to go with? And quite frankly, most of the nation thinks it's this model we should go with. Self-made man, success on the battlefield, he's no elitist and everything, despite the fact he ultimately becomes a multimillionaire, has a huge plantation, okay, but he came from nothing, okay? He is the guy most people think we should go with. Ultimately, thankfully, this is the model we choose. But there's a while in the 1820s, 1830s, in that era, in which it's a real toss-up. Which model are we going to choose for our army? I mean, it just would have affected all of the military, but it would affect the army in particular. And in a military sense, these are both successful men. They are both victorious in battle. They're both good leaders. They're both problematic personalities. But this is the model that ultimately I think serves us better. It's a model about education. It's a model about thinking problems through rather than drawing your saber and charging. Again, it worked for Old Hickory, but I don't want to have to carry around a lead ball in my chest because I made a decision that, while it's successful, now I didn't think that through. So, anyway, Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott wins, and he'll be constantly coming up. So let's talk about it a little bit more. Ultimately, he will be a brevet lieutenant general. That'll be his final rank. And again, brevet is an honorary rank. It means I can give you another star, but not pay you for it. Because again, we don't have medals and decorations at this time. So this is a way of rewarding you. You get to wear an extra star. It's usually generals who get brevets. Once in a while, you'll see non-generals get brevets. It's exceptionally rare, though, to see like a brevet colonel or a brevet major. You'll see it, but it's pretty rare. And the reason he's only a brevet lieutenant general is another weirdness about the United States. In the old days, George Washington was a lieutenant general, 3-star general. No one else ever deserves to hold that rank. I don't care how good they are. George Washington was the father of our country, and so no one else gets to hold that rank. We held that belief until 1864. No officer held the full rank of lieutenant general until 1864. Because Washington, if it was good enough for George Washington, by God, you don't deserve any more because you're no George Washington. So what Congress did is they posthumously promoted Washington. Multiple times. First, he was posthumously promoted to full general, or what we would call a 4-star general. Then when they create the 5-star general rank in the 20th century, he's promoted again. And then finally, he's promoted to a rank that is a made-up rank. It's basically a 6-star general. It doesn't really exist on paper, but George Washington, according to the United States Congress, I think the last one was passed in the 70s, I want to say. He is now General of the Armies of the United States of America. It's a unique title that only George Washington has. No one else is allowed to have it. And he is the senior officer in the United States Army for now and forevermore. Amen. So that's our weirdness. So anyway, so Scott, even though he deserved it, never got that 3rd star for real because George Washington had 3 stars. He doesn't deserve it even more than George Washington. Let's talk about Winfield Scott. He's a hero of the War of 1812. Totally legit. This is totally true. Totally legit. Again, he goes from 2nd lieutenant to general, brigadier general in 5 years. Through his own merit, on his own merit. I'll be the first one to admit that. He was the first American military officer to be sent on an observer mission to Europe. I kind of mentioned this as I was kind of blabbering, all right? He's sent overseas to observe another country's war. I think it was 1830. I want to say it was 1830, but don't guarantee that one. But I want to say it was the revolutions of 1830. He went to Europe. Please.
I don't know if we did the time period mixed up because it might have been post-Civil War, but I heard when we had somebody go over to Europe, like they had newer rifles that we chose not to adopt because we were too worried about ammunition.
Yes, that's post-Civil War. That's post-Civil War. Yeah, no, that's post-Civil War. So he's the first American to be an observer, official observer, at another country's military conflict. He writes a compendium of military laws. So today we have what's called the UCMJ, the Universal Code of Military Justice. And that has existed since 1947, 48, when we formed the Department of Defense. Because prior to that, the Navy and the Marine Corps is part of the Department of the Navy. They had their own rules, and then the Army had their own rules. And when we create the separate Air Force, everyone kind of says, okay, this is kind of goofy. We're going to have 3 independent secretaries running around deciding defense policy. We should have a unification there. And so we create the Department of Defense, and the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, and the Army are all part of the Department of Defense. So we said, well, now we got to have one code of justice, law. So we create the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And so now, it doesn't matter what branch of service you're in, you are governed by the UCMJ. Okay? He is the first one, however, in the United States to put it together and say we need one source in the Army, at least, for how we do things, for what our laws are, and so forth and so on. So he's the first one to do that. He writes most of the Army regulations during the early period where he's in charge. He literally just writes them himself. Again, he's a problematic personality, but he's not smart. He is smart. He's a wicked smart guy. But he's also kind of a jerk. You can do both. We talked about this. Human beings have that dichotomy. As we talked about, remember I mentioned Jimmy Carter. Really nice man on a personal level. All that stuff he's done with Habitat for Humanity, all that stuff. As a president, he was a terrible president. You could be both. Or you could be neither. Or you could be one and not the other.
Have a great general, terrible person.
Yeah, exactly. You can do that. Come on, there we go. He writes a manual of tactics for the United States Army. Well, not surprisingly, Scott's Tactics. And by the way, this supersedes the tactics manual written by Baron von Steuben, which was still in use by the Army. It was off by 1 year. He becomes commanding general in 1841, not 1840, and does stay till 1861. So I got the second date right. I was off. I know. I'm sorry. I was off by 1 year on that first. But again, for 20 years, he is the longest-serving general-in-chief, commanding general, whatever the heck you want to call him, in U.S. Army history. Thankfully, when we went to the staff system, and now we have the chief of staff, you are limited to how long you can do that job. It's a 2-year term, and almost everybody gets renewed for a second 2-year term. I'm torn. There have been chiefs of staff, just like commandants of the Marine Corps, just like CNOs of the Navy, where I think, man, I wish that guy had been in here even longer because he was awesome. But then there's some real duds, and you think, oh my gosh, thank God we have this rule, because otherwise that guy might have been in here longer. You know, we're always weighing that. Anytime you have those kind of rules, it's just like presidents only getting 2 terms. There's a lot of talk about giving Congress 2 terms. I'm very sympathetic to that. But you're going to lose something. You're going to lose that experience. There's no perfect, guys. There's no perfect. It's always about picking your poison. Okay? And term limits, whether they're president, whether they're the generals, whatever, they probably outweigh letting people be in there infinitely. But he is an example of where this was awesome. Thank God he was in here for 20 years. But again, how many examples could we have found where that would have been a horrible thing if this general had been in there 20 years? So anyway. And then lastly, as one of my colleagues jokingly referred to it, he suffers from foot-in-mouth disease, not hoof-in-mouth disease, foot-in-mouth disease, because again, he is so arrogant. He's smart, but he's also arrogant about his smartness. He knows he's the smartest man in the room. And so he is very frequently will just blurt out what he's thinking. If you haven't already in your life, you will eventually be in a meeting where somebody is saying something so incredibly stupid. You have to contain yourself from just blurting out, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. Okay? PowerPoint has been, or not PowerPoint, Zoom. Zoom has been so good for this because I can just blank my face and just do this or roll my eyes or mute my mic and laugh. I've loved it. That's the only good thing that's come out of the pandemic from my point of view is almost all the meetings are in Zoom, and I love it. Love it, love it, love it. Because I can actually be doing something on the side while I'm listening, okay? And I can listen to these inane things and just ignore it, okay? He didn't have a problem with just blurting out whatever he thought. And so he makes a lot of enemies both in the Army and in Congress. But he is so competent that he manages to keep his job until the Civil War. And when we get to the Civil War, we'll talk about why he loses his job. But again, that's what that is. And I've almost perfectly run out of time here, but I just want to start us off thinking about the fact that there's going to be a new attitude, a new conception about what a professional officer should be in this era. Because of those 2 men, and then the third we're going to talk about when we get back. And that's a politician who's going to have a role in all this. Okay? And thankfully, we have another class this week, unlike last week where we only had the 1 class. So I will see you guys on Wednesday. And if you have any questions or problems, just let me know.